Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to our Sunday service at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Men in Uxbridge. My name is Matthew Marion, and this morning I'll be starting off with my favorite jazz standards, All the Things You Are.
Greetings and welcome to this Sunday service, whether you are here physically or virtually. Welcome as we gather in this sacred place, this place that has been the home of women, men, and children for nearly 200 years, as we search together for truth, for wisdom, and that which makes us whole and holy. May we be reminded here of our highest aspirations and inspired to bring our gifts of love and service to the altar of humanity. May we know once again that we are not isolated beings, but connected in mystery and miracle to the universe and to this community and to each other.
This will be yesterday. you.
It has long been our custom as we gather to kindle a flame in our midst, a flame long the symbol of the presence of that which is holy, a flame long the symbol of knowledge and of wisdom. For we gather here this morning seeking to make our lives and this world more whole, more holy. We gather seeking wisdom, we gather seeking knowledge as we make ourselves better able to deal with the problems and issues of the world in which we live. I invite those of you who wish to join in the words of our affirmation. Love is the spirit of this church and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. This is the time in our service that we would normally light candles of joy and sorrow, as well as candles for the milestones in our lives. Since our service is largely virtual, we invite those of you who wish to share a milestone, a joy, or a sorrow to send it through the chat or through the internet as a email. At the end, near the end of the service, we will read those candles and light candles for them. I thought that this morning I would tell you a story entitled The Governor's Strongbox. It was the strongbox, fastened with a double lock that interested people. Wherever the governor traveled, that strongbox always followed, carried on a donkey's back. The people were suspicious. What was in that box? The governor had begun life in Persia as a simple shepherd. He had been known well in the community and he was much loved because he was wise and honest and friendly. So much so that he respected that the Shah of Persia would come to hear him. He too began to admire the simple shepherd for his wisdom and honesty and friendliness. So the Shah decided to appoint him as governor to rule over one of his provinces. The simple shepherd then ceased to look after the sheep on the hillside. He now lived in a large, beautiful house with a garden. He wore fine clothes. He had servants to wait on him. There were horses for him in the stables. And everyone was glad that the wise, honest, and friendly shepherd had been made a governor. But then the whispers started. It was that strongbox that people began wondering and talking about. What's in it, they thought, and one man asked the question. Why does he always take it with him, asked another. Perhaps it contains money he should have handed over to the Shah, commented another. The suspicions grew and grew, and soon the Shah heard of the suspicions, and he too began to wonder what it was that was so important that it was carried in a strong box everywhere that the governor went. Finally, he decided to find out, and he spent 2 days traveling across Persia to see the governor. When they met, the Shah was curious about the locks on the strong box and asked to see inside it. When the governor opened the box, the Shah was most surprised to see what was there. It contained an old sheepskin. The governor could see that the Shah was puzzled, so he explained, "Sire, this old sheepskin is my best treasure. I now live in great comfort, and I feared that I might forget that I was once a poor shepherd. So I carry this sheepskin around with me to remind me of my humble beginnings." Then the Shah realized that the governor was indeed a wise man, as well as an honest and friendly one.
Thank you.
Let us pause now for a moment, holding in our hearts and minds the fact that this is the 4th of July, the celebration of the first of a series of documents which promise all of us a life that may be lived in peace, a life that may allow us to be ourselves, to differ with others, to seek our way. May it be a time to remember that all of us are promised the freedom of faith, the freedom to live our lives as we see fit, and to work together as a community. Amen. Today, I thought I would talk about justice. And to talk about that in the context of our faith and our call to be loving people. This congregation has a long history. For most of that history, it existed in a relatively small rural town of Mendon. 200 years ago this time, members of the community were engaged in building a new church, the first actual church in town. All other buildings had been meeting houses shared with the town, but this building was to be solely a church. I say they were optimists because as I look around this room and see the number of seats, I feel quite sure that it has never had an overflow crowd for a service. And yet it was built with hope. It was built with the belief that people would come, would gather seeking a new view of religion, a new way to live their lives. We've had a number of great ministers in this congregation and many more good ones. There may be a few that don't fit into either of those categories, but so be it. But among the ministers in this congregation, the one that was the second minister in this building was a man named the Reverend Aidan Ballou. He came to the church in 1831 and stayed until 1843 when he left to create the Hopedale community. He was liberal. Before he was here, he served the Milford Church, but for a relatively short time before they asked him to leave. But when they built their new building, the largest and most impressive stained glass window is dedicated to him. We don't have stained glass windows. There are no windows dedicated to Aidan Ballou. I said there have been a number of ministers. There have been a number of ministers, and as I walk around this building, as I look at the decorations, I see no mention of them, no pictures, save one. It's a difficult one. It's Aidan Ballou, and he is right in front of my face every time I speak. The congregation in the 1830s heard a lot of stories of sermons of abolition. He was one of the most eloquent speakers on the subject. He came to the idea of passive resistance as a way of guaranteeing the same rights for all people. And his books, I don't know whether they were written during his time here or afterwards, but his books were read by Gandhi, who was so impressed that he used his ideas of passive resistance in his own fights to liberate people. And his writings were read by Dr. Martin Luther King, who patterned his plan of passive resistance after the words of Aidan Ballou. We have a long history of abolitionist speakers and ideas in this congregation. And I invite us to affirm them today as he did back then. It's been a long time since the two congregations, the Unitarians and the Universalists, merged in the 1960s. And it would be nice to tell you that the joining of Universalists and Unitarians combined two very different but liberal traditions, and that they made a difference with a tradition that is unique and truly wonderful. Sadly, the merger came about largely for financial reasons. And while it could be argued that the Unitarian Church might have survived alone, that could not be said for the Universalists. Liberal religion in the 60s was not particularly exciting. The Universalists had grown on the promise that a loving God would not make plans for every person before the world was created, that God could find a way to save, to bring to paradise every person. It was unique. It drew in a lot of common folk, farmers, and others, not the wealthiest, not always the best educated, but a group of church parishioners who had a real reason for their membership, who knew that if they tried to be good, that they were not automatically condemned to hell, that they could improve and work their way into salvation. The Unitarians were also kind of settled in their ways. A lot of the early spark was gone. Liberal religion was not particularly exciting. But politics. The civil rights movement was at its peak. The civil rights movement gave us an opportunity to do something with our beliefs. We, you see, could understand what needed to happen to create civil rights for all. And so, if people simply followed our plan, we would reach equality in years, or at most decades. In 1968, the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly passed a resolution to dedicate nearly 10% of its annual budget to back Black empowerment. We had leaders and congregation members willing to sacrifice their time, their energy, and sometimes even their lives to bring about change and bring progress. But with the death of Martin Luther King and other Black leaders, with the rise of protests against the Vietnam War, our energies were diverted and scattered, if not completely, then in large part. Making equality real took a back seat. And it has stayed in that back seat for a long time. But recently it's been building up. 8 years ago, with the killing of Trayvon Martin in February of 2012, as he walked to the townhouse of his father's fiancée, he was walking back from a convenience store wearing a hoodie when he was accosted by George Zimmerman, who called the police to report him as suspicious. Several minutes later, there was an altercation, and Zimmerman fatally shot Martin in the chest. He stated that he had been defending himself and was not arrested or charged, in part because of Florida's Stand Your Ground law. After national media focused on the incident, Zimmerman was eventually charged and tried, but the jury acquitted him of second-degree murder and manslaughter in July of 2013. And since then, things have been continuing. We've had more and more unjustified deaths, and most of the people that committed them were either affiliated with law enforcement or claimed some connection with it, and were almost universally simply allowed to leave with no charges, no investigation even being made. We hear of the death of Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy with a toy gun. The person who called to report this said he was quite sure that it was a toy gun and that he was just playing with it. But when law enforcement arrived, they warned him to drop the gun, put his hands up, and when he didn't do so, immediately shot and killed him. A 12-year-old boy. And Eric Garner in New York City selling cigarettes singly out of a pack, not with tax on each of them, not reporting the tax. And he was choked, begging for air until he died. Then there's the fatal shooting of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia as he was jogging, shot and killed by two men, perhaps three, who yelled racial epithets at him. And then finally, the prolonged death that we watched as George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, spent nearly 9 minutes with a policeman's knee on his neck as he begged for air. And perhaps it is partly due to the fact that it was right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, as each of us struggled to stay in our houses and watched more television than we might have, as we tried to protect ourselves and our families from that horrific virus. And so we are called back to dealing with racial violence. And after George Floyd, with protests of thousands and thousands of people all over the country, just a short time later, Rayshard Brooks was arrested for driving while intoxicated. And then, as he broke free and ran from police, he was shot in the back. An unusual sentence and punishment for drunk driving. And it has to stop. And so the time came for us to speak out. With the approval of the church board, we purchased a Black Lives Matter banner. Oh, not everyone would have been in agreement. Some said, quite correctly, that all lives matter. And it's true. But at this time, some lives are more in danger than others. Well, we may disagree with some of the actions and statements of the Black Lives Matter organization. At this time, the only real way of making our voice heard that we are supporting and in agreement with people of color, Black people particularly, is to hang a Black Lives Matter sign. Oh, I could write a 5 or 6 page addressing the topics on which we stand with others on this cause. But it wouldn't be easy to read from the street. No, the way to express our concern, our involvement with seeking the rights of all people, was a sign that was visible. Most of you know that that sign was destroyed. So what do we do? Well, the first thing we do is get another sign and put it up there. The message that we want to make is too important to let it die simply because we don't have a sign. And what do we do about the person or persons who did it? We don't dare, I think, get caught in the problem that our ancestors in the 1960s did, of forgetting to look to our beliefs, our principles. Our principles are important. They begin, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote, and these words are followed by our 7 principles. These principles aren't a creed. They're not something that we must swear that we believe in order to identify as Unitarian Universalists. They are calls to action. They are general statements against which we may evaluate our behavior. And the first of these are perhaps the most quoted and in many ways the most important. Our first principle: we affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. This doesn't mean that we or others should not be held accountable for our actions, but that in all of our actions with others, the humanity of both ourselves and of the others with whom we are acting should be recognized and respected. Our second principle is a little less straightforward. It reads, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Justice, equity, and compassion. Now, justice and equity are things that are reasonable, that we can think about, that we can make decisions about. But then there's compassion. Where does that fit in? It doesn't seem to, and yet perhaps it's the most important. And I ask us again, what do we do because our banner was destroyed? Yes, we get a new one up there. But what about those who did this? We would hope that the number of people in a town like Mendon would be few. We would hope that this was an exceptional act, and not something that would be repeated. And those people who would do such a thing, what should we do? Should we hate them? Should we see that they are punished severely? Is that what our response should be? Oh, that fits with justice and equity, perhaps. But what about compassion? I call on us now, for any time in the future, that when we find people with whom we disagree, that we listen to what they say, that we explain how we differ from them, but that we listen with respect, even if they are wrong, in our opinions at least, even if the things that they do involve violence, involve hate. We need to listen. We need to try to understand what it is that underlies their beliefs and their actions. For we are a compassionate people. And when we cease to be that, when we resort to hate and violence against those who have wronged us, we become no different from them. And so I ask us today to seek justice, to seek to be willing to listen and hear the opinions of others, that we be compassionate. For all of us make mistakes, some intentionally, most not. And we owe it to ourselves and to others to recognize the need for recognition of dignity and respect, for others to understand that compassion is an important part of dealing justice, an important part of being the people we are called to be. Do we have candles of joys and sorrow? A candle of sorrow that someone felt they had to cut our Black Lives Matter banner, but also a candle of joy and gratitude for how wonderful and supportive everyone in our community has been in response. From Hal Carson. From Bouchard's, a thing of thanks for the Mendon community for coming together in support of social justice and helping us learn and grow in our message. A candle of remembrance for Sonia's parents' dog, Zaza, who passed away this morning. She was a light and a joy for her family. A candle of thanks for nature's recurring cycles. The recent rains assure that after strawberries come blueberries. There's no name on that, but, oh yes, there is. But everybody knows that it came from Peter anyway. And finally, a candle of thanks to the Mendon police who came to the church, looked over the situation, took down the banner and are running tests on it, who have genuinely supported us and been good friends to us in a time of difficulty. They are a wonderful group. We thank them. And now, as we extinguish the candle or the flame that we kindle at our gathering, may it burn on in our hearts and minds. May it call us always to be with one another in support, in our shared learning, our shared experiences. May it be a guide to us and nurture and support. Amen.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Thank you all for joining us for our Sunday service. In reflecting about our events this week, I'd like us all to remember that in the end,